In this video, we're going to be going through the top 5 suspension upgrades that you can make to your BMW G80 M3. In the workshop with us today, we have another Tom Wrigley tuned BMW. This one to the tune of around 800 brake horsepower. But none of that power is any good to us if we can't put it down to the ground. Much like the engines are capable of so much more of a standard, so is the chassis and the suspension system on these cars. With a few simple upgrades and bolt-on modifications, we can transform the handling of the G80 M3 chassis and make it capable of so much more. Most performance cars come out the factory with an understeer bias already designed into them. This is because that is the safest way for a car to have its limit of grip, effectively just letting the front wash, lifting off the throttle, and even an inexperienced driver whose natural reaction would be to lift off the throttle in that scenario, the car would recover and it would then continue driving. However, that is limiting and it does slow the car down a lot on track if we're constantly fighting understeer, as the only way to recover is to lift off and slow down. What you want for a track car and a faster car in general is to get the chassis in a position where it has a more neutral to oversteer bias. So you can just use the throttle to modulate and you can use the steering inputs to get the car nicely around the corner, keeping your speed up in general. We saw with our F80 M3 and our 718 GT4 that increasing camber on both front axles of those cars had a huge improvement in terms of reducing the understeer and improving our lap times. And not only did it improve our lap times, but especially in the case of our Porsche, it massively reduced our front tyre wear as well, as we were then using the full contact patch of that tyre to get around the corner. As we're going through a corner, we're effectively transferring load and forces onto the outside axle as we approach and go through the corner. So the best way to illustrate this is with the wheel off the car. So if we have a car with no camber whatsoever, so it's perfectly stood up and we're going through the corner, what's going to happen is as the car leans in, we're going to be leaning over onto the tyre like this. This means as we're going through the corner, and we're starting to turn, we're actually lifting up onto the outside profile of that tyre and lifting the inside edge off the ground. This means we're using less of the tyre, we're going to overload that strip and it's going to scrub and it's going to understeer due to not having enough tyre in contact with the ground. So if we set negative camber like this, then as we go through the corner, we're actually going to be leaning onto the tyre, increasing grip levels at the front axle, and then as we go back out the corner, we come slightly back off it again. So this means that as we go through the corner now, with the additional negative camber, we're actually going to be using even more tyre, using all of the width of that tyre through the corner, maximising the grip, reducing the understeer, but also improving the tyre wear. Because before, when we're scrubbing that understeer like this without enough camber, we're going to be stripping the edge of that tyre away, like we saw in our 718 Cayman GT4 series, where we just destroyed the outside strip of that tyre because we weren't running enough camber. With the correct amount of camber, we're maximising contact patch and we're increasing grip levels to a point where we're saving on tyre wear and also reducing lap times. So it really is win-win when adding camber to the front axle of these cars. There is a problem though. The camber of the front wheels is not adjustable as standard. The solution is to take the standard top mount off the car, which is not adjustable as standard, such as this one, and replace it for one that has camber adjustment within it. This is our own top mount, which also has additional caster, which we'll touch on shortly. But this means that we can set the camber in different positions all the way up to negative 3.5 degrees using our version, which means we can get perfect settings for road, track, and even race use on this chassis. As well as allowing us to adjust the camber using the top mount, we also have another little cool feature integrated within our design, which is additional caster. So caster offers a few benefits, which we're going to go into more detail very shortly with a different component. But what it gives is increased steering feel and dynamic camber gain. This is where the steering wheel is being turned, the outside wheel is going to gain in camber as we're going through the corner. So we can run a little bit less negative camber in a straight line and gain from that additional camber being added as we turn the steering wheel where we need it through the corner. So it's a really nice recipe to get the handling perfect on the G80 M3, and it's derived from our direct relationship with the GT4 cars running in the British GT, using additional caster to gain that extra grip out on track. One of the most common grievances with the G80 chassis is a lack of steering feel, and this is something we hear quite a lot of feedback from our customers who have the G80s. When we talk about steering feel, we're talking about the amount of weight coming back through the steering wheel for the driver. Having that additional weight in the steering means that it's harder to turn and it gives more confidence to the driver when driving quickly. We talk about it as in terms of knowing where the front end is. You might have heard that before, where someone said, oh, I just don't quite know where the front end is. That means as you're turning the wheel, you don't really know how much the wheels are pointing, because you don't have that initial feedback through the wheel to gauge how much turning has just been applied. So when we don't have enough feedback through the steering wheel, it feels a lot like guesswork, and it becomes effectively a feedback loop where we're driving, we turn the steering wheel, we're then waiting for the car to react, and then we're going to apply a little bit more because we need a little bit more to turn in. When we add that weight into the steering wheel, it's much more intuitive for the driver. So as they turn the wheel, they already know how much angle has been dialed into them wheels, as they're feeling it back through the steering, and they can feel the resistance from the tyre, knowing how much they're pushing on. So when we increase that steering feel, we're also going to massively increase that driver confidence, allowing them to push harder and find the limits of their car. The key ingredient to bringing steering feel back into the chassis is caster. So we're going to be installing our solid front offset caster bush into the G80 M3, which replaces this rubber bush here. So this caster bush actually has three major benefits when fitted to the G80 chassis. It increases the self-centering torque, which means that we have a much better steering feel and feedback by adding in that caster. We also have introduced dynamic camber gain through way of the caster, which means that we've reduced the understeer further and increased that mid-corner grip, again giving more feedback and feel through the steering wheel due to the added weight from the additional grip. And then we've also improved stability under heavy braking by removing that flex that the standard arm has as it's going under really heavy braking and that rubber bush is flexing, so we're removing that entirely from the system. It's worth pointing out as well that obviously with a solid bush, it is expected on a lot of cases that this would increase noise and harshness, often referred to as NVH. However, in our caster bushes, we actually use a very high-end spherical bearing, which offers no noise increase to the chassis, especially no knocking. So it's actually a really nice upgrade, even for road use, as the amount of harshness increase is extremely minimal from this component. So you get all the benefits without much holdback whatsoever. So with the combination of the caster bush and the camber plate installed, both adding additional caster to the chassis, we've actually increased the caster now on this car by around 4 degrees. So that's going to increase our steering feel and feedback massively, and it's also going to add so much more in terms of dynamic camber gain that we're reducing that understeer substantially, and we're also getting the car to behave and respond exactly how we want it to when driving hard. That's going to give the driver much more confidence and allow them to find the limits safely but get further ahead than they otherwise would with the standard suspension components. Our second upgrade is a HASS kit, which will allow us to adjust the ride height of the car so we can get the ride height set exactly where we want them. You may be thinking, why not coilovers? And although coilovers do offer even more gains and even better handling, they are also a lot more expensive. So if we're looking to keep the budget in a certain price point, we would advise to go for the HASS kit instead to maximize the standard damper, because coilover kits of equivalent value to the HASS kit do sometimes have slightly more questionable build quality, and you could end up having slightly worse handling than before, as opposed to just speccing a nice quality HASS kit and retaining the OEM damper. It still allows us to set the ride height of the vehicle, corner away the chassis, and also set the rake angle to our desired settings. So we can get a lot of performance gains in those three areas alone, just by fitting the HASS kit to the car. It also has a stiffer spring rate than standard, which reduces the body roll through the corner, and the act of lowering the chassis also lowers the centre of gravity, further helping us with cornering performance. The stiffer spring though, on the HASS kit in particular, is actually still really nice for road use. So we're not going too stiff, we're not going to full track spring rates with this car, because it is still a daily driven machine. So this spring rate is more than comfortable enough for road use, but it just offers that additional stiffness required to manage the massive mass of this chassis. So it really improves cornering performance, and it also improves driver confidence, as when you're cornering really hard, there's a little bit less roll on the chassis, just wanting to push on that little bit harder, and it also helps us manage tyre temperature distribution a little bit more without that massive amount of roll as we're going through the corners. With all the work now completed at the front of the car, and we've added so much more grip into the front axle, we now need to turn our attention to the back of the car, because with all that grip at the front, we now don't have that ideal 50-50 grip distribution that we're looking for, especially on a BMW chassis. So to fix that, we're going to install 2 more upgrades at the rear axle. The first being our rear toe arms. So these replace the OEM toe arm, which does have toe adjustment via an eccentric bolt, but it is very limited as standard. With our toe arm fitted, it increases that range of adjustment, meaning we're no longer limited to what camber and toe settings we can set to at the rear axle, giving us full freedom of movement and range so we can get the optimum numbers to get that tyre working at its most optimum at the rear axle. It also replaces a rubber bush, as does our second upgrade being the traction arm. So both of these arms are standard, have rubber bushes in them. And when we're going through the corners, especially when we're going quickly, these rubber bushes flex, and that alters the rear geometry in terms of toe and camber as we're going through these corners. And if we're going slower through the corner, it'll alter it less due to less force going through the arms and therefore the bushes. This means that through high speed and low speed corners, we have a car that feels slightly different and responds differently, giving a lack of driver confidence and a difference in levels of grip. When we fit this rear traction arm to the car, we can set it at a longer length than stock. So it's an exact length longer than standard when we fit this to the car, and that alters the rear kinematics of the rear axle. So what this does is when fitted at the longer length, we're changing the arc pattern that it operates on. And that means that as the rear goes into compression, such as on throttle, the arc pattern alters in such a way that the front edge of the tyre is actually physically turned and pushed down forwards into the ground, increasing grip and therefore increasing traction, hence the term traction arm. With this fitted, we can improve things such as corner exit grip, any scenario where we're actually applying that throttle and putting the rear into squat. That means that this is being activated at its longer length, the new arc pattern takes over and physically rocks that rear hub a tiny bit, digging the front edge of the tyre into the ground, increasing mechanical grip substantially. So the combination of the rear toe arm and the rear traction arm increases both grip levels and stability levels, giving us all the additional grip we need at the rear axle, not only to balance out what we've added to the front, but also to put the power down to the ground and launch smoothly and effectively for a car such as this one that's been tuned up to 800 brake horsepower. Finally, we're going to be putting a full motorsport alignment onto the car. All of these components that we've fitted do nothing unless they are set up properly once installed. So it's really, really important that you get a really good setup on the car once you've fitted the aftermarket parts. We put a lot of track time in to find the optimal settings for this chassis. We use pro drivers and also the latest in technology to verify our data. We want all of our customers to get the most out of these upgrades, so if you purchase our upgrades online, you automatically qualify for a free suspension setup sheet. This is where we'll speak with you, find out what tyres you're running, what your main use of the car is, and any other supporting modifications, and we will build you our recommended settings for your suspension setup, so you can get the absolute best out of the upgrades fitted to your car. So there you have our top 5 suspension upgrades for the G80 M3. Our camber caster plates, a hasket, caster bushes, rear toe arms and rear traction arms, and then they've all been finished with a full suspension setup to maximise the products that we've fitted. This car can now put all of that power down to the ground, and it's going to handle much better, giving much more feedback through the steering for the driver, a lot more grip overall through the mid-corner phase, meaning it can carry much more speed and have much better chassis dynamics than when it came in. This is going to give the driver a lot more confidence, able to put that power down and really push hard in the chassis with so much more confidence to push harder and enjoy the drive in a completely different experience than before.